I came back from a fishing trip, sunburned and dead tired, dreaming only of a cold shower. But instead of the cozy, quiet backyard I was expecting, I found a full-blown wedding ceremony set up in the middle of my own garden. Without my permission. Picture this: while I was hauling my fishing rods and clean fish to the door, there was already a floral arch standing by my old apple tree, guests settling into folding chairs, and some orchestral music blasting away, right on my lawn. And the kicker? When I tried to figure out what was going on, this so-called wedding planner, named Karen, also the head of our local HOA, strutted over and announced, "This is for Ashley's wedding, you can't be here. Are you kidding me?" But before we dive into all this absurdity, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? And most importantly, how would you react if someone decided to throw a wedding in your yard without asking? Hit that like button, I promise. This story is worth it. And now, let's see how it all went down. My name's Sam Roods. I live on the outskirts of a small American town in a little house that belonged to my grandfather. After 2 days of fishing, I really looked like a zombie with fishing gear, half asleep, sunburned, and smelling so strongly of the lake that even my dog, Baxter, was giving me side eye. But when I turned into my driveway, the first thing I saw was around 30 wedding guests giving my grimy pickup truck this barely disguised look of disdain. They were dressed in elegant suits and dresses, and my old lawn lantern had been repurposed as a hanger for a sign that read, "Welcome to Ashley's wedding." And there, in the midst of it all, stood Karen, queen of our local HOA Homeowners Association. She used to go door to door handing out leaflets about the lawn must be no shorter and no taller than 4 inches, no pink flamingos as yard decor, and so on. She loved being in charge, and everyone else put up with it because they didn't want trouble. Karen didn't even say hello. She fixed her sharp gaze on me. "Sam, you're back sooner than I expected. This is my daughter Ashley's wedding. Everything's been cleared with the HOA, so don't worry, we'll clean up if we damage anything in your yard." My yard? Damage it? They'd already set up tents, laid out a banquet, and set up a minibar right next to my vegetable beds. I tried to explain that I considered this an invasion, but she just smiled. "Sam, we're neighbors. You're not against a little community celebration, right? Besides, there's something in the documents that says part of your property is basically a common area." Really? Turns out there was some ancient clause in the HOA statutes allowing the use of private land for community events if approved by the HOA's majority vote. And what does majority vote mean? Exactly Karen plus a few of her loyal sidekicks, since no one else ever shows up to the meetings. So I was basically left with no choice. Guests had already taken their seats, spread all over my front lawn. I went up to Karen herself. She was overseeing the florists. "Karen, this is my yard. I never gave permission. How could you just barge in like this?" She looked at me. "Sam, it's a wedding. You wouldn't want to ruin Ashley's big day, right?" Standing nearby was Ashley herself, clearly stressed out despite her gorgeous wedding gown. She didn't seem too thrilled about her mother's plans. The bride tried to say something, but Karen just hissed, "Go get ready, honey." Then Karen dropped a line that nearly made me swallow my fish a second time. "To keep from ruining the photos, just stay out of the way. There'll be a photographer, a videographer, and we'll post it all on social media." "Sam, it's best if you just don't get involved." So basically, there's a party on my property, and I'm supposed to hide on the back porch or drive away. It felt like she'd just wiped me off the map. I called the local police. They said, "Mr. Roods, this is a civil matter. The HOA has its own rules, and it's out of our jurisdiction." I tried calling a lawyer friend, but he said something like, "I'd need to see the paperwork, and that'll take time." Meanwhile, the wedding was already in full swing. Finally, I just threw up my hands and thought, well, if I can't stop the wedding, maybe I can at least make it unforgettable. The funniest part, none of those wedding people even bothered to ask if I was okay with random strangers commandeering my backyard. Some dude in a suit even asked me to park his car for him, thinking I was the valet. I was furious. But instead of making a scene, I remembered a piece of advice my grandpa once gave me: if you can't chase out the enemy, make them want to leave on their own. The idea struck me like lightning. I recalled that my buddy Richie, nicknamed Tinker, is in a biker club full of extremely colourful characters. They're rowdy, loud, but always loyal to the folks they respect. So I called him up. "Richie, I need some noisy backup. Picture this, they're throwing a wedding in my yard without my permission. I want to put on a show so wild that these guests never want to come back. You and the guys in?" All I heard was laughter on the other end. "Sam, we're on our way. Get ready for our concert." I also remembered this hilarious sound experiment I had goat choir. I once found a collection of extremely loud and bizarre goat bleats, super wild. I played them for friends once they nearly died laughing. So I hooked up a series of speakers to my generator, hiding them in the bushes and along the fence. Nothing was going to stop me now, especially after Karen's snide remark, "Sam, please don't frighten our guests with your, folksy ways. Just behave and enjoy yourself." Yeah, right. I was practically shaking with anger. The formal ceremony was supposed to start at noon. Everyone was all dressed up, seated on white chairs, the arch decked out in flower zoo. How romantic. But exactly 15 minutes before showtime, we all heard the mighty roar of engines. A column of 6 enormous motorcycles with American flags roared down my street like it was their own private rally. They pulled up in front of my property, and one of the bikers, Mike, nicknamed Grizzly, revved his throttle, causing a rumble so loud that even the neighbors peeked out their windows. The guests started shifting uneasily in their seats, expecting something crazy. Karen hurried around with her MIC switched off, trying in vain to shoo these uninvited bikers away like pesky FLIs. But they calmly parked in a neat row by the curb, respectfully not crossing onto the wedding area. That's when I turned on the goat choir all at once. Every speaker blasted a collective bar, but not the usual bleating, more like a hellish screech of a whole goat herd. One of the guests dropped her champagne glass. People started looking around, trying to figure out where on earth this insane noise was coming from. Meanwhile, the bikers, as if by signal, switched on their portable speakers and cranked up a rock version of the wedding march, some on guitars, some on drums, and someone joining in with goat solos of his own howling. It was such a crazy mashup that some guests clamped their hands over their ears, while others began filming it all on their phones, because you'd never see a freak show like this at a standard pretty in pink wedding. Just then, more engines rumbled from down the road, but these weren't bikers. A small van labeled Channel 7. Local news rolled up to the curb, and out jumped a short woman with a microphone, followed by a cameraman hefting a shoulder camera. They immediately aimed the lens at my yard, where the deafening wedding fiasco raged on. Bikers were pounding on drums, the goat choir bleating in fierce competition with the band, and guests were darting around, trying not to get caught in the roar of motorcycles and the wailing speakers. "I'm Betty Flint from Channel 7, the woman announced, shouting loudly enough to outdo the music, "and it looks like we just landed right in the epicenter of the loudest wedding this town's ever seen. Whose event is this, and why is it happening in Mr.?" She finally spotted me, probably reading the exhaustion and snark in my eyes. I gave a half-joking wave in greeting. A group of guests who'd almost been cornered by the microphone scattered, afraid of being on camera. The bikers, on the other hand, roared with laughter. One threw up the "Rock On" sign, another slung an arm around Betty's shoulder and hollered into the camera, "Welcome to the wildest wedding in the county." Betty took her chance, rushed over to Karen, who was in the middle of trying to convince a violinist to play louder to drown out the goat howls. Karen, seeing the channel logo, instantly tried to spin it in her favor. "I'm Karen, president of the local HOA," she declared, trying to keep her voice calm, though the camera caught everything. "This is my daughter Ashley's wedding. It's all official, and we have every right." Betty raised an eyebrow. "Is it true this yard belongs to Mr. She glanced at her notes, "Sam Rudes, and that you're holding a wedding here without his permission?" Karen started rambling about common areas, HOA statutes, collective approval. Meanwhile, the cameraman panned over to me. I stepped forward, listened to Karen's spiel about doing everything by the book, and said, "You know, I can read documents too. And as it turns out, my property isn't under HOA jurisdiction." But apparently that didn't stop Miss Karen here. Betty nodded, clearly interested. "So, you're claiming that what we're seeing is basically trespassing on private property?" "I've mostly given up trying to stop them," I shrugged. "If they want to party, have at it. But it's pretty weird they're throwing a wedding here without the owner's consent, don't you think?" Karen paled. Adding to the drama, out of a nearby car stepped Trey Blackstone, an HOA member known for wanting to push Karen out of her position for a while now. He saw the chance to get some publicity from her screw-up. "Karen, dear, I heard there was some little mix-up about property boundaries." He began smoothly. "Maybe you misread the statutes? If the HOA board had reviewed this more thoroughly, then Karen realized the ground was crumbling beneath her and grabbed Trey's sleeve. "Don't you dare undermine my authority. I'm the head of this board, and this wedding is perfectly planned." She didn't get to finish because Betty shoved her mic back in Karen's face. "Trey, you're also in the HOA. Does that mean the association itself is split on whether you can just occupy someone's yard?" Trey put on a sympathetic grin, like he pitied poor Karen. "I've long said things around here need more transparency. I'm just a humble board member, but we want change. I suspect after today, there'll be a lot of questions for our leadership." The cameraman was loving it. The footage was golden: rowdy bikers, uneasy wedding guests, Karen's twisted expression, and me, the actual owner, looking like the victim of arrogance. It could easily go on the evening news, spicing up the broadcast. I just sighed, watching Ashley the bride nearly lose her cool, while Karen clutched her HOA rulebook like a sword. Betty's voice rang with excited drama. "So, folks, stay tuned. We'll find out all the details when bikers and goats become witnesses at a wedding, and even the bride herself can't escape her own HOA. And it's all live here on Channel 7. You won't believe what's happening in our little town." The camera panned wide, capturing the absurd spectacle. And I, arms crossed, just thought, well, if trouble's coming, might as well make it big. Karen dragged the media into this herself, so now she's getting exactly what she deserves: a nice, public reveal of her nonsense. Right then, as if on cue, the door of the house across the street burst open, and out walked a lively lady in her 60s, with a big puffy hairstyle, Mrs. Harper, whose name was practically legendary in our neighborhood. She stood there wearing an apron that said "Too hot to handle," holding a rolling pin like it was a medieval weapon. This woman was famous for speaking truth to power with any local official, and Karen especially hated her for being too loud and stubborn. Wow, I barely set my pie in the oven, and I look outside to see the biggest neighborhood meetup of the year. Mrs. Harper shouted so loudly that it overpowered both the motorcycles and the ear-splitting goat choir. "Somebody pinch me, I feel like I'm at a rock festival, not a wedding." She stepped closer to the fence, squinting mischievously at Karen, who was practically hopping around the tables, trying in vain to shut down these inappropriate noises from the biker band. "Oh, Karen?" Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow. "You look kind of pale. Want me to bring you my special lavender tea to calm your nerves? Because from the looks of it, your makeup's about to melt right off." Karen shot her a bit of glare. "Mrs. Harper, would you please keep your distance? This is a private event, and no, uninvited guests are." "Oh, I know exactly what you think." The older woman cut her off. "But while you're in charge here, the entire neighborhood has to put up with your antics. Remember last year when you plastered those flyers claiming my garden was too bright? You said my peonies broke the overall aesthetic rule." She waved the rolling pin. "Excuse me for my flowers being cheerier than your typed up lawn length charts." Upon hearing this monologue, the bikers started laughing even harder. One began tapping a drum in rhythm as if providing a soundtrack to this battle of titans. Some wedding guests standing nearby were totally thrown off guard by Mrs. Harper's flamboyance, while others clapped in amusement. "I would've brought you something sweet, Karen," Mrs. Harper went on, "but I see you've got bigger worries right now. Maybe you should apologize to Mr. Roods for barging onto his property without permission." Karen, face flushed at being publicly called out, nearly tore the notepad she was scribbling on. Her eyes were burning with anger. "Mrs. Harper, you're the last person whose opinion I need." But the neighbor wasn't backing down, and Sam is the first person whose property you've ignored. "You know, I've been waiting for someone to show you that your rules aren't the holy gospel. Once, you made me take down my Christmas decorations 2 weeks earlier than normal because holiday lights must not remain past the designated date. Then you fined me for feeding wild ducks." Karen didn't know where to turn. On one hand, she wanted to kick this brazen neighbor out, but on the other, everyone was watching: guests, bikers, a local news cameraman, and even a few bystanders gathering at the gate. "Well, there you have it, Karen," Mrs. Harper concluded, feigning pity. "You invited the whole neighborhood to this wedding, but forgot one little detail: asking the actual owner of the yard. So don't be surprised if bikers, TV, and me, your favorite neighbor, all show up. If you barge into someone else's space, be prepared for people to waltz right into yours." She turned to me and winked. "Sam, if you need help cleaning up or anything else, just holler. I'd bring you my lemon pie, but I'm afraid Karen will file a complaint about unregistered pastries." All I managed was a grateful nod as Mrs. Harper proudly turned and marched back to her house. She seemed to be sending the message, Karen isn't all-powerful anymore, and our community is not a silent crowd that's easy to boss around. The bikers applauded and whistled as she left, and I realized that this brief cameo was as impressive a performance as our goat choir. I hoped Karen would remember it for the rest of her life. Finally, Karen lost it. She charged over to me, shouting, "Sam, are you messing with me? This is scandalous. This is my daughter Ashley's wedding." I just smiled. "Karen, this is my land." "Oh, sorry, I forgot you call it your common area. So why shouldn't I join in too?" Guests started whispering among themselves. Some were trying to hide from the chaos under umbrellas. Meanwhile, my biker buddies decided to improvise goat solo sets. One mimicked goats on a microphone like he was competing with the original recordings. Karen yelled, "I'm calling the cops. All of you, get out." But, as a reminder, the police already knew about this wedding fiasco and probably weren't in a hurry to show up. Within minutes of our sonic assault, some guests fled to the trees, while others came closer to watch. Because let's be honest, this was a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle you'd never see at a typical white and pink wedding. Then another surprise guest appeared, an HOA board member named Steve Harrison. He zoomed up in his official badge, trying to act like he was about to restore order. He stepped up to me. "Sam, I'm here on behalf of the HOA. We officially forbid your brutish show. We have the right to fine you at least $3,000 for breaking noise rules and using unregistered vehicles on HOA property." I pulled out my property papers inherited from my grandpa and said, "Steve, this land was never part of the HOA. Back when the surrounding lots were being developed, someone just drew a red line around my fields on the map. But they never actually voted or whatever you guys do. I'm not in the HOA and I'm not subject to your silly rules." He tried to object, scrambling through something on his phone. I kept smiling. "Even if you voted, those are your internal decisions about someone else's private land. I was never officially notified, and more importantly, I never signed any agreement to join your association. So the only thing you can slap me with is your angry stare." After another moment, Steve realized he'd lost. The law gave him zero power to fine me on my own legal property. Karen stood beside him, clutching her HOA rulebook. Her hands trembled with rage, her lips pressed so tight they seemed about to burst. "This is a setup. You planned all this, Sam," she shouted. "Well, how else do you deal with someone who shows up with a wedding in your yard uninvited?" I shot back. "You tried to outplay me, Karen, but them's the rules. If you cross the line, expect a nasty surprise. This is my yard, and I will remind you of that." Karen decided her last remaining weapon was more noise. She snatched the DJ's MIC, beckoned the wedding band she'd hired, and ordered, "Play louder. We've got to drown out those motorcycles and that goat screaming." And so a volume war began. On one side, the wedding band with violins, desperately trying to drown out the speakers and rock solos from the bikers. On the other side, our goat choir, roaring at decibels that shook the leaves on the trees. The guests were in shock. Some were on the verge of hysteria. Some just sipped champagne and laughed. Then I noticed Ashley, the bride, standing off in a corner under a tree, tears brimming in her eyes. She'd probably dreamed of a quiet, romantic ceremony. Instead, she got a circus of bikes and goats. I felt bad for Ashley. I walked over and quietly asked, "You really didn't want all this fanfare, did you?" She shook her head. "I just asked Mum to have a small gathering at a friend's ranch, but she arranged all this behind my back and picked your yard because she said it'd look perfect in photos. Now it's turned into a total circus." That's when I realized this was going too far, and the kids, the newlyweds, didn't deserve to be the casualties of Karen's ambitions. So I told the bikers to dial it back. The goat choir faded into barely audible bleating. Karen noticed and thought she'd won. "Oh, so you've finally come to your senses?" She sneered triumphantly. I replied, "No, I just don't want to spoil Ashley's day, out of respect for her. But all this chaos? That's on you, Karen. You forgot where the boundaries were." Suddenly, the bride grabbed the MIC and announced, "Friends, my fiancé and I have decided to hold our ceremony not under this fancy white arch, but over there under that old oak tree or apple tree, away from all this noise. If you want to celebrate with us, great, but leave this flashy circus behind." The guests were stunned, but most followed Ashley. Some were just fed up with the blaring music and glam chaos anyway. In the end, the wedding happened, but on my terms, with Ashley taking responsibility. They had a mini ceremony by the tree. Someone picked up an acoustic guitar and played a gentle melody. It looked far more modest, yet heartfelt and touching. The community woke up when neighbors heard the roaring motorcycles and came to see what was happening. They started asking, "So, why exactly did the HOA decide it could seize your yard?" Once they found out the truth that I'm not even in the HOA and Karen basically took over someone else's property, people realized this was out of control. A few days later, Karen officially resigned from the HOA, citing stress and misunderstandings. In the community, the board had no choice after the bad press and the huge public outcry she caused. I don't really feel like I won anything special. All I did was remind folks that private property belongs to the owner and boundaries should be respected. All I wanted was a bit of peace after my fishing trip, yet I ended up with a loud party, unexpected community support, and even some new biker friends. Most importantly, nobody walks up to my yard with unauthorized projects or pointless demands anymore. I hope you too. Never let any Karen walk all over your rights or personal space. If every Karen gets her lesson, our lives will be quieter and more fair. If you also think Karen deserved a lesson, smash that like button. Want more stories where the good guys come out on top? Hit subscribe and be sure to share in the comments if you've ever dealt with a Karen in your life and how you handled it. We'd love to hear your stories.